Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاش الجيل الصاعد، جيل من شعب مجاهد، عاش يبني ويجاهد، عاش بكفاحه الخالد، عاش يبني ويجاهد، عاش بكفاحه الخالد، راجل واحد مبدأ واحد،
عاش جيل ثورتنا،
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار. عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية،
وسمعنا مبادئ أممية.
أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجندي العربي عاش.
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الثورة عاش.
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروي حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروي حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار فيها مداخل طالع منها لهب النور والنار. عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار فيها مداخل طالع منها لهب النور والنار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايد صدرناه. حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايد صدرناه. قولوا معايا حيوا معايا
عاش عاش العامل عاش.
عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجيل الصاعد عاش.
العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان، عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان، عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان، عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية،
ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ردينا عليك يا جمال وايدينا في ايديك يا جمال، وطلعنا معاك يا جمال نبني وياك يا جمال. ردينا عليك
يا جمال
وايدينا في ايديك
يا جمال
وطلعنا معاك
يا جمال.
نبني وياك يا جمال. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش عبد الناصر عاش.
Небо утреннего стяг, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы.
Продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
С неба милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И снова снегопад
and welcome along to The World Tonight. And we are in the middle of rather dramatic events, it would seem, though that could go for perhaps any day that has taken place over the last 2 years. Before I begin properly, I want to give thanks to Comrade Michael, a Polish comrade based in France, for having me on his program. We finished up just about an hour ago, following a very interesting discussion on a number of issues, some of which we agreed upon, some of which we disagreed upon, but that just made the discussion more interesting. So be sure to go to his channel and check that out if you haven't already. And yes, we're going to be having Michael on the program to do a sort of a return leg, shall we say, where I'll be asking him some questions about the state of play in both France and Poland. So that's the first item of business. We've got some, of course, dramatic events in Ukraine, which various people are talking about. So I'm going to be looking at that in the first part of the program. We have, again, various things to say about the events in the United States as well, particularly involving the United Auto Workers. So there's things to say there as well, and I'll be taking questions, comments, etc. From you, the audience. Now, before we begin properly, I'm just going to take a moment to drop the various links into the various different social media platforms. This is what happens when you do 2 streams back to back. You end up overrunning somewhat. So you'll forgive me if I improvise frantically whilst trying to post these links in the various different locations. And post your questions below if you haven't done so already in the chat. So be sure to do so. I'll respond to them in the order that they come in. And if you want to support the program in some way, be sure to either go to the Patreon page or the Buy Me a Coffee link, which I'll post up in a minute. And there's going to be a live stream coming up this weekend. It's probably going to be on Sunday now, due to the fact that I have too much on tomorrow to fit it in, basically. But it's going to be a program on the origins of the People's Democracy period in Romania. So if you're interested in that, that'll be coming up now on Sunday of this weekend, probably at 2 p.m, and that'll be the patron stream for this week. So that's going to be the first part. I mean, I was going to try and do the whole of the history of the Romanian People's Democracy and the collapse and fall of that in one session, but it turned out there's rather too much history to fit into that. So it'll probably be a couple of programs, maybe even 3. All right, let's get started. And we have with us so far Seabolt, who says good evening. Luca, good evening to you. YepX says good evening, love the show, even though I can't always catch it live. Well, that's what the catch-up's for. Is there an email that you have in which I can send you suggestions for people to collaborate with? Yes, there is. I've just put it in the chat below. Good evening to my comrade Terry from the Class Consciousness Project. And when we get to discussing the United Auto Workers, the basis upon which the other comrades and myself started the project over a year ago, I think has been proven correct on an international basis when we get to the role of a certain Mr. Sean Fain. Roddy, good evening to you. Jay, good evening to you out there in Norfolk, Virginia. Carlos, good afternoon to you in Nicaragua. Irish Partisan says Budanov for president. Well, is that for president of Ukraine or president of the United States? Because conceivably he could do either right now. He could probably run against Biden and win. Good evening to Playing Polonius out there in British Columbia, Canada. Good evening to Jenny, who says, latest PSYOP just dropped. Check out Justin Moan if you haven't heard. I haven't heard yet. I will research that after we're done here. Oz, good evening to you. And good evening to David Green in Illinois. All right. Irish Partisan says in several posts, so I'm going to read all of them back to back. Sputnik's informed sources has provided details of a British plan. Well, that's a good start. Of a no-fly zone over Ukraine and creation of an expeditionary force to be deployed in Ukraine. It is planned to secretly transfer to Ukraine largely highly maneuverable NATO forces from the border areas of Romania and Poland to occupy defensive lines on the right bank of the Dnieper. A preventive strike by the armed forces of Moldova and Romania against Transnistria is also not ruled out. In order to overstretch the forces and resources of the Russian armed forces, it is envisaged to deploy in Norway and Poland a contingent of NATO forces and armies of selected members of the bloc. At the same time, strategic infrastructure facilities in Russia's northern regions may be attacked. After that, according to the British plan, NATO forces will create a buffer zone, we've heard this before, within the occupied positions, including the border with Belarus and the territory around Kiev. And the released forces of the Ukrainian army should withdraw to the Special Operations Zone. One question of clarification. By withdraw to the Special Operations Zone, are they talking about withdrawing them to what? Around Lvov, or sending them to the front lines to try and hold things up there? But look, I'm not surprised that somebody in Britain would be thinking of this, or somebody more specifically, some clown in the Ministry of Defence or on the backbenches of the Conservative Party, or perhaps even in the Labour Party. This plan seems very familiar, actually, that has been that Sputnik is reporting on, because this plan's been mentioned on numerous occasions before by various different people that I would refer to as the usual suspects. It seems like the kind of thing that, you saw if you've seen my discussion yesterday with Kit Clarenberg, that this is the kind of thing that his old friend, in ironic terms, Chris Donnelly and the other sort of maniacs from British military intelligence would come up with. I would point initially, though, just in responding to what Irish Partisan has posted, to several problems with this. Right, first of all, if they're going to send enough forces from the border areas of Romania and Poland to occupy defensive lines on the right bank of the Dnieper River, the Russians are going to see that almost instantaneously. I mean, the Americans and the British, principally the Americans, have their eyes in the sky. The Russians have their satellite systems and other ways of observing the NATO armies as well. So to move that amount of men from NATO areas into Ukraine, and all the equipment that they'll need, and the support infrastructure that they'll need to occupy, I don't know whether these are pre-existing defensive lines on the right bank of the Dnieper, or they're going to have to build them, to occupy these either pre-existing or newly built defensive lines. So all of this is going to take some time. That's a significant number of men and machinery and support infrastructure that they'll need to put in place in the areas they're deploying these men to. And who are these troops going to be? Is this a resurrected version of the other very silly British reactionary idea from, a year ago, 18 months ago, that they were going to send in Polish, Romanian, and other forces from Eastern Europe, mainly Poles and Romanians, and to do some dirty work in Ukraine? Are the British talking about deploying their own forces? Because I bet they're not. I bet my bet. I'm happy to prove. I'm not happy, but if the British are talking about deploying their own forces, then let me know. But is this a resurrection of the idea of shoving Poland and Romania into the meat grinder? Because that might not sit too well with the internal politics of either country. But even if they manage to do it, the Russians are going to know if suddenly thousands upon thousands of NATO forces pop up in Ukraine, because I bet the Americans won't do it. I'll bet now that the US imperialists won't risk their own men in this endeavor. They don't even really want a war with Iran, because the US military knows that they can't fight it, no matter what crazy old John Bolton and the other gang of criminals in the US think tank world think. So if the plan is to shove the Polish and the Romanian armies into some sort of holding pattern to try and tame the Russian bear in Ukraine, that doesn't strike me as a particularly workable solution. But it's just the kind of idea that a maniac in the Ministry of Defence in London would come up with. So I don't think that what they're talking about there is possible to do on the basis that it has been described to me at the moment. I think the Russians would see it coming a mile away, and I think that they would ring Washington straight away and say, and have told them, well, if you do that, then we'll destroy them. Then the interesting question comes up, which is if the Americans are going to refuse to send their own men into this, which they will refuse to do, then if it's Poland and Romania, I mean, I know that the Polish compradors, and I'm going to talk again to our Polish comrade about this when I have him on the program, are the most wretched group of servile criminals you could possibly imagine. But even for them, that's a very risky maneuver. Sending Polish forces into Ukraine to presumably go into a direct and open fight with the Russians, whereas, of course, they've been sending mercenaries into Ukraine to do a hidden fight with the Russians so far. So I don't think that this is I think this is some mad idea that some British officer or think tank loony has come up with. And I don't even think that the American imperialists themselves will be on board for this. Well, and as for the strike by Romania and Moldova into Transnistria, again, like, okay, so if they could overrun the Russian force in Transnistria, well, that's possible to do, I would assume. There's not that many of them. But again, like, the Russians would take that as an immediate declaration of full-on war. And this is the reason why the Russian armed forces have kept, part of the reason why they kept forces back, and why they haven't deployed the full scope of their military into Ukraine and into the special military operation as yet. They're holding back just in preparation for something like this. And as for the idea of openly launching attacks on Russian infrastructure in the north, I mean, I'm not surprised that some British maniac has come up with this. But the reason why that they've come up with this, the US won't go for it. The US will not risk its own forces in an open confrontation with the Russians. If they were going to do that, there were much more propitious opportunities to do that, and they're more than happy to just continue the war going and allow the Ukrainians to die for them in enormous numbers. Bear in mind also, I don't think either British reactionaries will be risking their own forces in this. They know now, after trying to big up the idea for 2 weeks of reintroducing conscription, that they can't possibly fight a war with the Russians. They can't. There's no infrastructure in this country that would allow them to sustain some kind of long-term deployment of forces in Ukraine or into Finland. And if they're going to try and attack the northern part of Russia, the Russians aren't going to spare them. It's going to be an open declaration of war, which is, again, why the US imperialists won't go for it themselves. They're not going to risk their own men in a stand-up fight with Russia, not now. So again, this is a plan come up with by an increasingly desperate collection of insane reactionaries in London who have decided, with some justification from their class interests point of view, that it's all going wrong, that they need to force the US to commit more to the Ukraine scenario. There was an editorial actually in the Financial Times by this old reactionary liberal type Financial Times leader writer called Martin Wolf, who is scolding the rest of Europe about the fact that they need to double down on the commitment to Ukraine. Why? Well, it's the same reason we've discussed on this channel many times before, which is that the imperialists collectively are in a deep hole. The war that was supposed to bring them the treasures of Russia has not worked out anything like they expected it to. It's all going wrong. It's all going wrong in the Middle East. For all Israel's brutalities, they are losing the war in Gaza and cannot beat their regional enemies. They cannot beat Hezbollah. The Yemenis can now send missiles to strike inside the city of Haifa itself. The American imperialists have failed to intimidate the Yemenis out of their naval blockade. The Iranians basically told the US imperialists, if you strike inside Iran, we will strike at your bases in many different places across the Middle East, and you will not like that. And so as a consequence, now you have the US imperialists hitting apparently 85 sites in Iraq and Syria, which is still disgusting, but that won't have been what their original plan was. I think that the US asked Iran to basically allow them to bomb some kind of site in Iran itself, even if that site, and they would tell the Iranians where it was going to be so that there would be no casualties, basically. But Iran told them to fuck off, and quite rightly so. So now they're dropping all these bombs on Syria and Iraq. I'm going to bet that it will kill people, of course, but it will have next to no difference on the abilities of the Iraqi resistance forces to actually operate and to fire on the US bases in the region. So they're losing everywhere. And so some mad British fuckwit coming up with this idea that they're going to try and force the Poles and the Romanians to go to war against the Russians in Ukraine in order to preserve the project there and live to fight another day, perhaps keep it going for 5 years under the brilliant leadership of this goon Budanov, who's just a pure creation of the CIA and MI6. Well, that's not going to work either. This whole thing is far too risky. Like, the people keep saying, oh, Biden wants to run as a war president. No, the Democrats want to run Biden as a war leader without actually being in a war. They don't actually want to be in a war with the Russians because they know very well that they would lose. And the British can't fight a war with the Russians because they simply don't have the men, they don't have the machines, they don't have the industry to do it. Neither do Romania and Poland. They are far weaker now, militarily speaking, economically speaking, socially speaking, than they were when they were people's democracies under the Warsaw Pact, even with all the limitations of government like that, which was headed by Ceausescu, or the government of the old Polish People's Republic, with all its limitations, was stronger than the one that they've got there now, economically and militarily. So these nations can't go in and fight Russia. If they try to deploy Romanian and Polish troops, they'd get wiped out, and they wouldn't be able to resupply them. Now, these idiots in London think that they can play with their tin soldiers. Maybe that's a bit of an out-of-date reference. They're all playing Kaiserreich or something, or Hearts of Iron on their computers, and thinking that, well, if we move the Poles in here, the Romanians in here, we can put 40,000 men on the ground, and that'll show that Putin who's boss. No, it won't. Because not only is it the case that they are lacking all of those economic, military, and social resources I've just talked about, but they're also comprehensively outperformed by the Russian military. The Russian officer corps have shown themselves to be far more competent than anything the NATO countries have got. It would be a disaster. And they know it, which is the reason why I don't think that the British will be proposing to deploy their own men. All right, so Irish Partisan has answered my question. The Special Operations Zone being the Lvov. Some Russian observers have been saying that NATO troops could go in using NATO's Operation Steadfast Defender as cover. Right, so this puts a bit of a different complexion on it, if this is the big idea. If the big idea is that they are going to withdraw the what is presumably soon going to be the Budanov regime into the Lvov area, and what, they're going to insert NATO in there and declare victory? Well, possibly that could work. That if that's the limit of their ambitions, that they're going to seize essentially the area around Lvov, and that's going to be it. Then, well, maybe that's got more of a chance of working because it wouldn't exactly involve the involve the direct confrontation with the Russians, but who knows? It all seems like a very insane idea at the moment. Right. Okay, so we've got continued problems with the volume. Yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm going to probably have to order a new microphone because this one seems to be not good enough for doing live streams. So is it the case that people can't hear the stream at all, or is it just the case that the audio is low? Good evening to Martin, who's joined us. Hello, hi, says, what's the view on Russia? Well, that's a rather big question. Hello to Paul, who's first time catching a live stream. Oz says they, I think with reference to Poland, have been doing this already in a limited manner with the mercenaries, aka renewed contracted fighters from the NATO reserve armies. Is modern Russia a Spanish Republic sort of situation? No, I don't think that's an accurate comparison. For reasons I will go into if required. Oz says, I think a Polish commander stated that they were renewing contracts with reserve soldiers and sending them to Ukraine. I have heard that, but they've been sending, I think apparently 10,000 Poles have been in there as so-called mercenaries. Again, there's a big difference between that, though, and mobilizing yourself directly into some kind of direct confrontation. I think that the only way that this plan works for them to insert forces into Lvov to preserve a Ukrainian statelet is if they get the tacit agreement of the Russians beforehand. If they're going to grab Lvov and the area around it that used to be part of the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Austro-Hungary, then that could work. In terms of them, the Russian leadership seems to think that that area is basically a poison pill anyway, and so they may just let them have it and then set up their new border. And if the plan is to occupy that, declare that to be Ukraine, put that in NATO, and then militarize it in the hope of getting the rest of it back sometime, then, well, that it's a stupid idea because it's not going to work, but that may be a workable solution in terms of something that the Russians will just shrug their shoulders, take over the rest of Ukraine, and then the big idea that they've got about running some kind of terrorist insurgency, the Russians know how to deal with that very well. They'll just destroy that completely, and eventually this statelet on the edge of Europe will end up costing a gigantic amount of money because it'll be ruinously corrupt. And it'll end up probably being swallowed by a combination of Hungary, Slovakia, and Poland. So it'll be a disaster, basically. Thoughts on the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign? Yeah, it's a intelligence operation dressed up as an NGO, basically, supported by Trotskyite organizations. Good evening to Beju, my comrade down south. It seems, asks Beju, that the level of working class consciousness is critically low in Poland and Romania too, not only in the UK. It seems so, though these big farmers' protests that are kicking off are an interesting development. I'm looking to talk to more people with regard to the actual situation in Poland and Romania. I don't know enough about the class struggle situation in both countries as yet to draw a clear judgment on that. Dan Kovalik, who says, thanks for a great show. Good to hear from you. Jenny suggests HyperX as a microphone. Yeah, I'm going to check it out. Some people seem to have problems with it. Some people don't. I don't know whether people are listening on headphones or listening on speakers. I'm not sure. Oz says it's worth noting, Irish Partisan, that NATO using 90,000 men in this operation, which is, if memory serves, a single division in the Russian military. Also, these 90,000 men, I don't know. I know that's what NATO lists as participating in the operation, but I've seen various different estimates as to how many are actually combat troops. They seem to be counting everybody who's in uniform and involved in it, even if they're sat at a desk in Brussels. So it could be that the actual number isn't any more than 50,000, and that's ridiculously low. That can't do much. Versus the fact that the Russians have, 400,000 apparently currently deployed in the field. That possibly, we don't know the exact number, but also that they've got many hundreds of thousands in reserve and are training more and more up all the time. And if it seems like that NATO are jumping in, you're going to get even more volunteers volunteering for the Russian army. So, again, I don't see this, if it turns into a confrontation, I don't see NATO doing too well with this. View on the PKK-YPG. Well, there's two things there. This is in response to a question from D. You've got the long-standing Kurdish campaign for independence, which is one thing, and the Kurdish national rights, which, of course, they've been fucked over for on many different occasions. And Kurdish rights to retain their language, their culture, their traditions, etc. But then there's the question of these organizations, YPG in particular, which have turned themselves into auxiliaries of imperialism. And that presents a difficult problem, because whereas nobody wants to see the national rights of the Kurdish population in, well, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, trampled all over, the way to secure those is not siding with imperialism. Imperialism has betrayed the Kurds over and over and over again. Yet each time the Kurdish leadership keeps making the same decision, which is, well, we'll trust imperialism again. I'm sure it'll be fine this time. And they get betrayed again. Look, the path forward, I think, for them in Syria is to reach an agreement with the Syrian government to get Kurdish language and cultural rights respected within the Syrian Republic, but to end the quest for independence, because that's just not going to work. There's no way the Turkish reactionaries, or even Turkish leftists, I mean, I'm not sure of the precise angle that many of the different Turkish Marxist organizations are taking on the Kurdish national question, but certainly the current setup does not favor a Kurdish state. What they could get is a decent bargain out of the Syrian government, which is what they should get. They should certainly end the alliance with US imperialism. It has been a ruinous disaster for them, because US imperialism is going to quit the place in the end. Not immediately. They don't want to appear weak, especially for the Democrats in an election year, but they're going to leave. And they're going to leave, and the Kurdish forces will be trapped between the devil and the deep blue sea. So better to make a deal with the Assad government now before their inevitable betrayal and sellout by the US imperialists, is my view. Right. Okay. Paulina Vasiliev says, Francis Boyle keeps boasting about taking down genocidal Yugoslavia at the ICJ when he analyzes the case of South Africa versus Israel. Can you recommend reading on the Yugoslavia case? Yes. I don't take these lawyers and the judgments of the ICJ particularly seriously. They're useful propaganda points for us to use, but again, like the genocide case against Yugoslavia, first of all, I would say Slobodan Milosevic was posthumously found not guilty of the charges that were brought in against him, even though he died, of course, before that verdict came in. Also, in terms of books to read, to answer Paulina's question, the Michael Parenti book on Yugoslavia, which was principally about the NATO campaign against Yugoslavia over Kosovo, and the book there sort of goes through the way in which the U.S. imperialist policy towards Yugoslavia evolved over time, got progressively more and more reactionary, some of the mistakes of the Titoists, and how by 1984 the Reagan administration was actively decided that the destruction of Yugoslavia was a priority for the U.S. imperialists. And this Parenti documents all of this. So the book's called To Kill a Nation, The Attack on Yugoslavia by Michael Parenti. You can get it in various different locations. It's a really good overview and analysis of various different aspects of the war. And as always with Parenti, it's a very accessible book to read. So yes, To Kill a Nation by Michael Parenti. Be sure to read that. It's the book that sort of opened my eyes on the subject. Right. Ironic that Poland is or will finally be one doing the partitioning. Well, maybe. That's from George Romney. Oh, didn't know he was still kicking. Okay. Hello, hi, says, really, I thought Trotskyites do not support Ukraine. Oh, yes, they do. Or Russia, except one fringe Trotskyist group, although one of the so-called socialist groups in Ukraine applied to join the Fourth International. Yeah, well, let's think about this. To actually, you got to analyze not just what the Trotskyite position proclaims itself to be, but what it is in practical terms. See, the Trotskyites in Britain, you're right in one sense. In Britain, it's only the AWL, the Alliance of White Liberals, who openly supports the NATO and US imperialism. They're just the most extreme manifestation of it, though. If you look at the rest of the Trotskyites, the SWP, the CWI, what's left of them, they're split from a few years ago, and the International Marxist Tendency, who are now disguising themselves as communists, all of their positions basically say, well, Ukraine, some of them will concede that Ukraine is being controlled by US imperialism, but their characterization of the Russian government as imperialist is incorrect. They claim that, oh, well, it's US imperialism versus Russian imperialism. The working class has no stake. This is an incorrect judgment. It's not only incorrect with regard to the Russian government as it's currently constituted, the Russian state being an imperialist state. It's wrong about the way in which that the struggle in Donbass developed and was powered by working class, well, originally Ukrainians, now Russians, and that the long delay between the, as Kit Clarenberg outlined in the interview yesterday, between the Russian government refusing to act and barely even wanting to aid the fighters in Donbass to actually being forced into it, partly by the intransigence of US imperialism, but also by domestic pressure, principally coming from the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. The Trotskyites get all of that wrong. They just declare very lazily, oh, well, Russia's imperialist, the US is imperialist, there's nothing to choose between them. This is totally incorrect and leads you to very false conclusions, which the Trotskyists have made again in their analysis of the subject. So whereas only the AWL are out there waving the NATO flag, the rest of them might as well be, because they've made an incorrect analysis on this, just as they made incorrect analyses on everything else since Trotsky himself died in 1940. Okay, so hello, hi, says, many groups fight for the Kurds, such as the MLKP and TKP-ML, which take a dislike to US imperialism. Well, they might not like US imperialism, but they've ended up fighting on the side of it. And this is the problem when you end up hitching yourself to such causes which have a history of being led by people who will jump into bed with US imperialism at the first opportunity. So yeah, there are groups in there which proclaim that they are against US imperialism, but objectively speaking, they've ended up siding with it. And by the way, as my comrade Steve Sweeney has outlined in the interview I did with him last year, there's quite a number of the international volunteers who went from fighting for the YPG, to fighting for the Azov lot in Ukraine. There seems to be quite a heavy crossover between the two, implying, of course, that these are either adventurers or intelligence assets or both. George Romney says again, Russia has not as yet ordered a full mobilization. The Ukrainian government is conscripting disabled people, old men and women into the infantry. And this is very true. Russia has only done one partial mobilization. They have a far greater manpower reserve to draw on and a far greater industrial capacity to draw on. Plus, the Chinese have basically staked their reputation or their future in certain respects, on the Russians winning this struggle. So if the Russians need further industrial capacity, I don't think they do, but they have the industrial capacity of China behind them, and the industrial capacity, which is not to be underestimated, of the DPRK as well. So again, Ukraine can't win this, and the people in the CIA and the Pentagon and the Ministry of Defense in London, they know this, which is why they're coming up with these mad schemes now to try and declare themselves to have had some sort of victory. So it wouldn't surprise me if what all this scheme comes down to in the end is that basically they seize Lvov and the area around it, declare that to be the real Ukraine, and try to essentially flood that with weapons and money in the hope of sustaining a terror campaign against what will then be Novorossiya and Malorossiya. But they will fail. They will fail because their own systems are falling apart. They'll fail because they're trying to prop up a squalid military regime that's got even less legitimacy than like the regimes they're basing it on, such as those in Taiwan. What you'll end up with is another Kosovo, which is a gangster regime run by like the scum of the earth. That'll be a hive of the worst kind of villainy you could possibly imagine. Drug smuggling, people smuggling, arms smuggling, you name it, it'll be happening there. It'll be a horror that they've created out there. More than the horror that they've created right now. Martin asks, is there some way that we can chip in to buy you a new microphone? Well, okay, if anybody wants to chip into the fund on that one, you can go to the Buy Me a Coffee link in the chat I've just posted up there. Anybody who wants to donate to the microphone fund, be sure to go in there. Carla Del Ponte herself came to the same conclusion, I think, about Milosevic. Yes, that's correct. There are videos on YouTube with Michael Parenti talking about Yugoslavia too. Yes, that's very good videos, as always, from the great man. Muniz says the Danish professor Jan Oberg has written a lot about Yugoslavia. He works inside the EU and talks about how the division of Yugoslavia led to the next war and how easily it could have been avoided, but someone wanted more war and that's what they got. Yeah, when the US imperialists decided that the breakup of Yugoslavia was a priority because Tito was gone, the imperialist system was facing a crisis in the early 1980s. They needed to actively roll back and destroy socialism in all its forms. So whereas they were prepared to tolerate and even collaborate with Tito to a certain extent in the 50s and 60s, now was the time to end it all. And that's why they took the ultra-aggressive stance that they did, because they needed socialism gone. And unfortunately, the socialist states and their leaderships had degenerated to the point where it was the internal contradictions that killed them. The US imperialists helped the process, but they certainly didn't create it. Martin says, two things can be bad. Well, apparently no one's familiar with that. Carl Shannon says, first time catching a live stream. Well, I hope you're enjoying it. Morgan says, the Syria to Ukraine rat line. Yeah, there's an awful lot of people who've been down that road. Hello, hi, says, why can't Trotsky actually be like Sam Marcy and form a British Workers' World Party, PSL, to actually oppose imperialism? Well, I'm not familiar as much with the work of Sam Marcy. I know Caleb Maupin's done videos on him, and I don't know a lot about the WWP. The PSL does not have a good reputation in its modern incarnation, though. Certainly, I've heard negative things from American comrades whose judgment I trust about that. Carl Shannon says, my impression is that the difference between Bosnia and Kosovo is that Bosnia is a German colony and Kosovo is an American one. There's a good high degree of truth in that. The Bosnia War seems to have been, it was of course backed up by US imperialism, but the Bosnia Protectorate is more, I think, and the Croatian Protectorate is more influenced by German imperialism. German imperialism was very much all in on the break of Yugoslavia. It was a way for the newly reunited Germany, the Germany that had carried through the counter-revolution against the socialist government in the East, to grab back the territories that German imperialism had been traditionally aiming at, all the way back to the era of the Kaiser. So they were very much all in on the project to destroy Yugoslavia. And they and through the EU have come up with came up with the idea of the protectorate of Bosnia. Yeah, Kosovo was much more of an all-American, Anglo-American affair, to the point now where I think you've still got a statue of Bill Clinton there, of all people. Jesus, the horror. May I ask your view on Sudan? Asks Luca. Are we talking the current goings-on in Sudan? I'll be honest with you, I haven't researched it enough to give you a clear view as yet. If there's a demand for me to look at it further, I'm happy to do so, but it'll take me a while to pull together some material on it. So if you want me to address it, I will do, but I'm not going to address the question when I don't know enough about what is going on there. So, can we spell it KK Kosovo? You use Maoist standard English. Well, you can if you like, but excessive use of Maoist standard English may lead you to ultra-leftist conclusions. Ash, first time catching my first live stream in weeks. I have a bit to catch up on, but listened to 9 in 4 days. Well, my God. Hope you're catching up soon, and good to see you back in the chat, Ash. And Muzzle Paint, solidarity to you. Irish Partisan says, do you think there are a lot of similarities between the Bosnian and Ukrainian war? Izetbegovic and Zelensky. I think Izetbegovic was more of a significant figure than Zelensky, but all of these wars of the U.S. empire, and particularly in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, have certain similarities between them. I mean, they've all created like squalid statelets. I mean, Kosovo especially, that is dominated by all kinds of criminality and scumbaggery. So I'd say there's more of a comparison directly between like someone like Hasim Tachi or others with Zelensky. I mean, Zelensky himself is significant only in the sense that he's just the latest iteration of a puppet regime. I mean, had Poroshenko won the election in 2019, we'd be exactly where we are now, perhaps in an even worse situation. Poroshenko, lifelong bullshit artist and con man, is probably a little bit more of a skilled politician than Zelensky is. But the reason he was chucked out of power, and bear in mind also, Poroshenko himself thought that he could resolve the situation in the East by doing a deal with the Russians, only to be told by the fascist forces that was out of the question. Then he became the most enthusiastic Banderist. Of course, he doesn't really believe in all of that. He believes in money and feathering his own nest. But had he won, we would still be in this situation, because in the end, the similarity is that, to use Irish Partisan's example that he's given there in his comment, Izetbegovic wasn't truly in control of events, and neither is Zelensky. As various commentators have pointed out, including Kit Clarenberg, when the Europeans, particularly the Germans, were trying to bring the Bosnian War to a close on terms favourable to them, that they found would be acceptable for their interests, the US basically told Izetbegovic, no, carry on, we've got your back, you can do this, just keep on fighting the Serbs and we'll keep supplying you. Then, when the American imperialists had made their point to the Germans that there could be no peace on any terms, unless, of course, it was in the interest of American imperialism, then they told Izetbegovic, right, you're fucked. It's all over. We're pulling the plug. Sign whatever's in front of you. And Izetbegovic and the Bosnian Muslims ended up with a far worse deal than he would have got had they signed the original German-inspired deal. So, again, Izetbegovic turned himself, an old-school fascist who turned himself into, of course, a pure puppet of American imperialism, ended up getting shafted by American imperialism in the end. And, of course, the other comparisons are that the Bosnian forces had various sort of various Al-Qaeda figures in there as well. It was a sort of dry run, again, for the operations that they would run later in Libya and Syria and elsewhere, which is using these jihadist organizations as their foot soldiers. Again, the way that the way that the breakup of Yugoslavia was portrayed in the British television and the British bourgeois press was so far removed from the reality of the situation on the ground that it might as well have been a work of fiction. Right. Carl says, Izetbegovic seemed like a true believer, had a prison record in socialist Yugoslavia for Islamic extremism. Yeah, Izetbegovic was a hardcore fascist. Long-term track record of being so. If only the Yugoslavs had had a tougher prison system. Zelensky was a guy hired to play a role. He's played it as aggressively as he can, as much as a coke habit will allow. Hello, hi, says, how do we end the right wing's control over populism? Well, the right wing, at the moment, I mean, we're talking in very broad terms here. I mean, are you addressing this question in terms of America, of the European nations? Because at the moment, the reason why it appears that the right is making all the running is because they're the ones who are closest to the pre-existing political tendencies within the classes that are making the running in these populist waves at the moment. What's happening with populism, particularly in both in Europe and in the United States to a certain extent, is that it's being powered to a degree by, as I've said before, smaller factions of the bourgeoisie, factions of the ruling class, be it in the United States, France to an extent, Germany, that are not the toppermost layer of the bourgeoisie that is most immediately profiting from imperialism. You're talking more sort of national, or in the case of the United States, even regional capitalists who are being pushed out of what political influence that they did have and are facing death at the hands, business death, shall we say, at the hands of the gigantic monopolies. That's certainly what's happening in the United States. And the pre-existing political tendencies of these people all veer towards like various forms of like reactionary petty bourgeois politics, which is what's being expressed by the likes of Trump at the moment, or the AfD in Germany, in my view. I'm inviting the German comrades back on to discuss that in a future episode. And so the fact that what is referred to as the right are making the running is because it's the social layers that are more typically associated with them that have a tendency towards those kind of politics, those kind of political expressions that are leading the way on these movements at the moment. And there's the proletarian elements are tail-ending those petty bourgeois leaders, and a distinctive proletarian politics hasn't emerged as yet, though there are tendencies towards that. And so that's why it seems like these right-wing forces are making all the running. It's the class nature of the rebellions that are taking place at the moment, and a fracturing of the ruling classes' political coalitions. There is always coalition building going on that the ruling class has to engage in to a degree. They have to bring on board the lower layers of the petty bourgeois, of the national bourgeois or regional bourgeois, depending upon the size of the country. They have to bring in a good section of the petty bourgeois and even a section of the labour aristocracy to make their ruling via the methods of bourgeois democracy work. Now, of course, it doesn't matter as much when you build a new coalition and go over to fascism, but even in fascism, you have to have some kind of base to sort of support your fake revolution. So that's my opinion on why it seems like the right is making the running at the moment. It's the reflection of the nature of the social class forces that are in play at the moment, that there is not a strong working class component to this as yet. So, right, where are we going now? Good evening to Siegfried. Jenny says, Zelensky is kind enough to move aside now to make way for a new puppet and make some coin too. Well, if he's lucky, he'll get out with his loot and get to retire to Miami. Maybe he can go to Disneyland. Irish Partisan says, the Death of Yugoslavia documentary was a work of fiction. Yeah, I remember watching that. And Misha Glenny's, if you remember him, wretched book on Yugoslavia is also a work of fiction worthy of Robert Conquest himself. Maybe Lech Walesa is a better analogy. Well, Walesa was just a pure agent of imperialism, I think, for a long time. But we can come back to that when I've had a further discussion with Michael, the Polish comrade. Zelensky is bourgeois neoliberalism who is protected by fascist mercenaries. Well, Zelensky, I don't think, has any beliefs at all. I mean, he signed up basically with a sort of he was like a creation of various different oligarchs, including Kolomoisky, and then rapidly found out when he was in office that he didn't actually have any power, and that if he wanted to physically survive, he had to do whatever it was that the US asked of him, and that's what he's been doing ever since. Muzzle Paint says, USA started dropping bombs on the latest extended campaign 2 minutes after East Coast markets closed for the weekend. Coincidence? I think not. Well, time everything with the stock market. That's the imperialist way of war. So I will be interested to see what the actual results of their bombing look like in terms of if they actually hit very much. Slava, good evening to you. Who says, do you think the revisit of Nuland to Ukraine was to pick who would replace Zelensky? Who would replace Zelensky or even Zelensky? I think that she'd been sent by the administration to settle the dispute. We'll see what kind of settlement that she arrived at when this thing's played out. But yeah, she was sent in to read them the riot act, basically. Basically tell them, right, stop fucking around. You're in charge. You're out. You're out. You fuck off to Miami. You take your loot and go elsewhere. And stop ruining things, because she's been invested in this project for a very long time, of course. So I think she was there to basically read them the riot act and tell them who was going to take over and tell them how it was going to be. So we'll see who ends up on top here. President Jesus says, did you see Brianna Joy Gray's interview with an old union activist about Fein? She delicately addressed some of the criticism, and the guy had a meltdown, started comparing Trump to Hitler. I'm not surprised, and here I will mention something that I did refer to at the top of the program. Like various comrades, including the comrades of the Class Consciousness Project, have had this discussion about not just the union bureaucrats, but the union activist layer. Like Fein is just a complete. He's a Len McCluskey figure, basically, and if you don't know who Len McCluskey is. He's this guy who used to be the General Secretary of Unite, always claims to be, he was an ex-docker. In reality, I think he worked in an office on the docks. He portrayed himself as this sort of big-time left-winger. And it turns out that he was just a sort of standard union bureaucrat, funneled millions upon millions of union members' money to the Labour Party, and ended up basically just helping to lead the Corbyn movement into the ditch where it was always heading. Sean Fein is exactly the same. And the point is not that one union bureaucrat is better than another, but that in imperialist nations like the USA and Britain, the trade union bureaucracy, whether it's the bureaucracy of the left or the bureaucracy of the right, all ends up, of course, the right ends up doing it straight away. The left ums and ahs and ends up doing it anyway, endorsing imperialist political forces. And that's by the very nature of things. The trade union bureaucracy in Britain has been incorporated into the management systems of the British state for over 100 years, probably since at least the 1890s, maybe earlier, but at least the 1890s. And so trade unions themselves, as Marx and Engels analysed back in the 1850s and 60s, are temporary institutions. They are institutions which the proletariat builds to defend itself in the period of the formation of capitalism. And they enter into the field of class struggle. And the limitations of trade unionism reveal themselves almost instantaneously. Marx talks over and over again about how class struggle under capitalism might lead to temporary victories. You might get a win here or a win there, but that's all undone within a few years because, of course, the capitalists have to constantly press against any win that you've got that detracts from their profits, and they have to restore those profits one way or the other. And so trade unionism is a temporary phenomenon. It is a temporary, largely defensive phenomenon of the working class. It is not ever going to lead to any kind of revolution. The very nature of it makes it anti-revolutionary, because its whole basis is that it becomes an intermediary force, that is, the bureaucracy becomes an intermediary force between capital and labor. So its very nature makes it counter-revolutionary. It takes working class consciousness up to a certain point, but it can't go any further. And so the fact that Sean Fain and these various other sort of bureaucrats emerge in the UAW or elsewhere, make a lot of noise, and then what? Endorse Joe Biden? Joe Biden, who, by the way, let's leave aside all of the crap that Biden's doing right now to enable the Israeli genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza. Let's just focus on the fact that Joe Biden carried out the biggest single act of strike breaking in US labor history since Reagan did in the Air Traffic Controllers Union, PATCO, in what, 82? 83, something like that. So it's the biggest sin when he busted the railroad strike. Used Congress to do it. So this man has carried out, this president has carried out the single biggest act of union busting in the United States since the days of Ronald Reagan. He's done, now Trump didn't do that because of course Trump didn't have the railroad strike to do it, to deal with. I'm sure he would have done it if it would have come up. But the fact is that Biden did it. The Democrats did it. And not only that, Biden has a history as a senator from Delaware, as a representative for the credit card industry. Biden's whole career has been not just as a standard Democrat, but not even like an old-fashioned Labor Democrat from a previous era. He's been like a pure servant of the worst and most degenerate elements of American capitalism, the most parasitic elements of American capitalism, for his entire career. So when Sean Fain goes on CNN or MSNBC and starts babbling on about Biden, the workers' candidate, versus the bad guy Donald Trump, Biden is worse than Donald Trump. Donald Trump doesn't have a political career going back 50 years. Yeah, Donald Trump's got a history of fucking over contractors and employing scab labor on his building sites. Yeah, Donald Trump's not a friend of the working class at all, but he never pretended to be. Or he's trying now, but not very convincingly. Joe Biden has a 50-year-long career going all the way back to the early 1970s of pretending, of using like the fact that he can sort of talk like a working class American, kind of, to disguise the fact that he has been in bed with industries that have been relentlessly fucking over the American worker for decades. And he's not only behind like the biggest single act of strike breaking in recent years, he is, of course, has a long history of making class war upon the American worker via fronting up things like the crime bill and various other acts of legislation that he's been associated with as a senator. Let's look at his 8-year record in the Obama administration, which of course passed on the cost of the Wall Street crash of 2008 relentlessly to the working class. Didn't do anything to even moderately restrain the Wall Street thugs that ran the Obama administration. Biden was their creature as much as Obama was. So Fain's going to go on there and the morning shows, and he's going to wave his finger and do his phony working class act about how Biden's the friend of the working man and Trump's the evil union buster. Well, the truth is they're both union busters. They're both anti-worker candidates. And if Fain had any testicles in his sack whatsoever, and if he was worth any of the praise that the American left has showered on him, then he would have at the very least not endorsed anybody. But of course the entire bureaucracy of the UAW, I'm guessing here, correct me if I'm wrong, is as linked to the Democratic Party as the entire bureaucracy of Unite, Unison or the GMB in Britain is linked to the Labour Party. The bureaucracy wants Biden. Probably a lot of them have careers in mind in the Democratic Party, and so the bureaucracy got Biden. And I'm willing to bet that many UAW members will basically tell their own bureaucracy to fuck off and end up voting for Trump or not voting anyway. Because Biden, everybody can see through him. Other than even like Fain doesn't believe the things that he's saying. You can tell he doesn't believe it for a moment, but the bureaucracy wants it. So as a loyal servant of the UAW bureaucracy, he will deliver it. And nobody should listen to a damn thing he says on anything ever again. Certainly not this general strike shit he's been coming out with. Well, the guy who endorsed Joe Union Buster Biden is going to lead a general strike. Of course he's fucking not. All the Democrats have to do is pick up the phone and tell him no, and he'll say that a general strike is turning up 5 minutes late to work on a Tuesday. He'll just redefine what it is. So the way for the working class to liberate itself does not lie through fake left or fake union leaders like Fain in that country or Sharon Graham in mine, or whichever country you're looking at, particularly in the imperialist countries. There's no hope through working through the unions or the bureaucracy. The unions are defensive organizations at best. The real task, of course, is building communist parties who can lead the working class to liberation, not in wasting your time backing one supposed left candidate or another who's just going to fuck you over. Right. Where are we? Okay. Right. Trying to find where we left it. So no, I've not. President Jesus, you got a rather long answer to your question. I haven't seen the meltdown that this guy had, but I will now make a point of watching it. Hello, hi, says, the right present themselves as popular, but they are backed by capitalism. Well, so's the left, mate, to be honest. And their rhetoric gets rejected by working people, which is why anti-fascist movement increased in the 2010s. Look, we're going to have a conversation about that, but as it's getting on, as we're getting over an hour now, what I will do is I will, if you can repeat your comment in another stream, I'm happy to pick it up because there's a lot in what you said there that needs to be discussed. But it's too late on for me to do it now. Right, Carl Shannon said, Solidarity sold the Polish workers a bill of goods that had Catholic nationalism on it, but the implication was that they could keep their jobs in the welfare state. Yeah, that's what they all sold. That's what Lech Walesa was selling. It's what Václav Havel was selling. It's what the Romanian traitors were selling. They all said, oh, don't worry, we're just getting rid of the bad bits. You'll get to keep all the good bits of socialism. Of course, the first thing that disappeared was all the good bits, and all the bad bits stayed. You just got capitalism with it. Today, the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk, site of that famous strike, has around 300 people working there, down from 20,000. Yeah. And that's not just automation and improvements in production. That's a vast cutback in production. Oh, we have an anti-communist in the chat. Excellent. Siegfried, what, the Germanic hero himself, says taking away people's land is cultural devastation. That's incorrect. First of all, who gave them the land? And if we're talking about taking away people's land in this country, well, that will mean, and we'll be taking away the land that belongs to the aristocrats and angry business. There's no small farmers left of any significance in Britain anymore. Whatever romanticised picture you're thinking of the idyllic trad lifestyle simply doesn't exist. And plus, it's horrendously inefficient. When the time comes, we will take away the land from the British aristocracy. We will dissolve the British aristocracy. We will take away the land from agribusiness and we will collectivise it. And we will remove the horrendous inefficiencies that corporate land ownership has produced in this country and take ourselves back to a situation where we can produce 100% of our own food again. What you dream of and whatever romantic idyll you have in your mind simply does not exist in modern capitalism. Didn't even exist in earlier capitalism. Forget whatever peasant dreams you had inspired by the work of Richard Wagner or Adolf Hitler and read something real about Marxism. Marxism is to destroy everything that is normal. No, it's not. No, it's not. Just look at the actual record of the... we're talking about Poland. Let's talk about the Polish People's Republic. Earlier on Michael's live stream, we were talking about the number of births that happened in Poland in the year that he was born, which was 700,000, and the number of births last year, which is 200,000. Tell me, our friendly anti-communist who probably would describe himself, and I'm presuming you are a man. If you're not, do let us know. Or if you identify as something else, also let us know. That you to consider yourself to be pro-family. Well, how pro-family is it in the restoration of capitalism in the East, where they basically took the birth rate down below replacement level? How pro-family is that? How pro-family is it to put yourself into power in a place like Ukraine, and even before the beginning of the Russian special military operation, to have devastated the birth rate, because not only have you crushed the working class economically, but you've crushed them spiritually as well. You've created nations where nobody even wants to have kids anymore. What part of Richard Wagner's epics is that in, Siegfried? Please tell me. Please tell me where it is in the great fascist doctrine that you crush the life and spirit out of a whole nation and call it glory. All of the things that you dream of are simply have to be romantic nonsense because they don't stand up to material reality. And I know you fascist boys don't like material reality because when you have to look at it, for making strong nations, making conditions where families can actually reproduce and have more than one child, where you can actually have a nation which you can be proud of, where the nation can unify around a positive ideal. All of those things happen under socialism. Under fascism, which I'm presuming you're in favour of, or under capitalism, all those things go to wither and die because it's an outmoded system, and no matter how much violence you try to restore your petty bourgeois idyll with, it will never be restored. The only thing you will be restoring is the power of the monopolies. Hope that answers your questions. Right. Hello, hi, says the Vatican has always backed... where are we now? Chat's slipping. Nationalism, like in Spain, no offence to religious people. Well, they always back fascism when it comes down to it. You'd have to be less than no ashamed to endorse Biden, or perhaps Hunter S. Thompson once observed that the Democratic Party was one of the dirtiest political operations in existence, and that there's every chance that if they thought you weren't going to vote for their candidate, that they'd slip something in your drink and you'd wake up in your bed next to a dead prostitute with some Democratic political operative next to you going, "Don't worry, son, we can keep it out of the press. Just make sure you endorse our guy." Or that kind of sleaze. Right. Don't forget Biden's race politics. Well, yes, I mean, I kind of mentioned that in the crime bill, but also Biden, before he was Genocide Joe, he was Segregationist Joe. So maybe somebody wants to ask Sean Fain about that, you know? Maybe ask what he thinks about Biden's long-term friendship with Strom Thurmond, with the king of segregationism, the man who used to do multiple, 8-hour-long filibusters to defend racial segregation. That was Biden's buddy. Spoke at his funeral. Trump was just a bourgeois candidate. MAGA communists not in control, unfortunately. Jenny says, let's go Brandon. Mass incarceration, Joe. Yeah, there's many names for him. So our fascist friend is back. Love your folk. Well, actually, mate, we do. My love is for the British working class. My love is for the oppressed peoples of the world. It is not for the ruling class. It is not for the parasites who are reducing both our own nations to dust and many other oppressed nations in the world to dust. When we build socialism in the imperialist countries and overthrow this system, we will make our alliances with the oppressed peoples of the world, just as Lenin and Stalin suggested. And then we will grind the bones of the British Empire into dust and scatter it on the fields to grow our crops in. Right. Joe, go to jail for supporting Israel. Go to jail for supporting Israel. Biden needs to get kicked out. Okay, I'm not quite sure what you're saying now. To their credit, at least Labour at one point had the common courtesy to lie and claim to represent the British worker. The Democrats' message is along the lines of, you'll get nothing, and liked it. Okay. What time are you now on the next stream? Probably be 10:30 tomorrow. Right. Apparently you're enjoying the ranting against the fascists. Well, you know, fascists has rated something positive. Let's quote Mao. We've turned the negative of a fascist, maybe it's Javier Milei in the chat, into a positive in that it set me off in the right ranting direction. Sean Fain and his acolytes in the Labour aristocracy will scream, Trumpety Trump, Trump, Trump. Your resurgence of fascism. Yeah, well, same thing, but this is going to need to be thoroughly debunked. Okay. Right, that brings us to the close of things tonight. Hello, hi, says, Joe Biden supports Israel's crimes against the Palestinian people. Well, that's entirely correct. Okay, right. If you join me again tomorrow, we'll be back at the same time, 10:30 British time. Thank you to everybody for joining me tonight on the chat. It's been an excellent discussion. We'll have this up on the Patreon ASAP tomorrow morning. So, again, if you want to contribute to the microphone fund, there's the link to the Buy Me a Coffee page. And we will be back with you tomorrow. Have a decent evening wherever you are in the world, and we will be back with you again very soon.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the forgeman he has been, and he's made the workers' state the best the